我想，他的著作给我们一个比较显著的一个提醒，就是怎么运用想象。那我们也知道说，人类学的性质，我们一直有争论。那从一开始以来，人类学应该说是以社会科学作为它的定性的性质。那后来呢，我们越来越多的意识到，人类学其实有人文学科的性质，也就是说，它必须运用想象，它对真实的时间、真实的地点、真实的人物发生的现象，以及这个社会行为文化，在我们要对它理解的时候，要运用想象。但是呢，这里也存在一个问题，就是如何把人类学和其他的非虚构写作把它区别开来。我想有2点应该是很重要的，一个就是作为人类学或者民族志作者，必须有收集到充分的这个 data 来支持我们的论点。第二个就是实际上你要给出一个实在的一个 context， 所以读者才能理解你想说的是什么。那我们带着这些期望来这个欢迎Mueggler教授给我们做这个讲座。Professor Mueggler.
So, first, I want to thank Professor John Mueggler for this invitation to speak to you tonight, and thank you so much, Professor Sumkin, for that introduction, and thank you all for coming this evening. I want to apologize for speaking in English. It's been a long time since I've really spoken Chinese, even in conversation, too long, and I've never published scholarship in Chinese. I can't say how much I admire those of you who are able to publish, to do scholarship in a second language. It's a very difficult thing, and I'm in admiration of you. I wrote this talk originally for an English-speaking audience, not for this audience. So you'll see that in this talk there are many quotations and many terms that are translated from Chinese into English rather than simply left in Chinese, and that's a bit awkward when presenting the talk to a largely Chinese-speaking audience such as yourselves. Anyways, so thanks for coming, and I'll just plunge right into a talk that I prepared. So, shortly after their master's death in 1760, so mid-Qing, Jianlong period, a slave named Han and 5 of his companions submitted a confession and a plea for mercy to the local magistrate in northern Yunnan. They had been caught terrifyingly between 2 factions of their master's kin and enslaved persons, struggling over who would succeed the native chieftain, the Tusi, Guo Jiayu, as sole owner of all the lands and persons in a sprawling native domain. After the chieftain's funeral, they said, they had been hounded from dawn to dusk by 2 of the chiefly household's high-ranking bondsmen, inciting them to enter into a pact to plunder the household's wealth on behalf of the chieftain's 22-year-old concubine. For a time, they said, these insects stupidly listened to their talk and made the error of going along with them. That was just a quotation from the slaves. A party of bondsmen and slaves allegedly broke through a window into the boudoir of the chieftain's elderly wife, beat her, and confiscated her personal property. After another bondsman warned them that beating and humiliating their mistress could never be pardoned, the slaves took fright. These insects, they said, fearing punishments, consequently sought refuge in the mistress's chambers to repent and to seek forgiveness. How do we narrate the fleeting glimpses of enslaved subjects in the archives and meet the disciplinary demands of history that requires us to construct unbiased accounts from these very documents? This is a question that Melissa Fuentes asked in her eloquent study of enslaved women in Bridgetown, Barbados. Put differently, how might we excavate experiences of enslaved people from archives that systematically exclude their voices while negotiating the demands of a liberal sensibility that requires subjects to speak authentically for themselves? Fuentes continues, how can we probe the subjectivity of people whose presence in the archive is rare, fragmented, and distorted? So this is a kind of question that Fuentes asked about the Caribbean, which is a very different kind of place than 18th century China, where notions of voice and authorship and rhetorical strategies of the archive and configurations of subjectivity were very different. The few scholars who have approached the subject of slavery in early modern and modern China have shown that bondage and forced labor spanned all social and economic realms and persisted well into the 20th century. And so I'm talking about Han Society as well as other non-Han societies. Yet the presence of enslaved people in historical writing about China is fragmentary, their experiences infrequently interrogated, their importance for fashioning of history seldom valued. The confession of Han and his 5 enslaved companions was preserved until the 20th century in an archive of documents in 2 languages in the North Chiefly House and purchased by the Beijing Library in 1942. The document I just quoted is perhaps the least consequential in a flurry of legal claims authored by people of higher ranks struggling over who would become the native chieftain of the domain of Munya. This is a small domain within Rubikjo. The muted presence of slaves is difficult to discern in this pile of documents, yet the intentions of enslaved persons were clearly points of articulation that determined the course of the outcome of this legal case. In this talk, I want to look at some of the ways that words of enslaved persons who did not speak or write Chinese found their way into Chinese script in the form of narrative arguments submitted to the court in legal claims. In describing relations within the chiefly house that domestic slaves shared with the native chieftain and his wives, concubines, daughters, and bondsmen, I want to make 2 points about slavery and literacy. The first point has to do with the sharp division between kinship and bondage that is conventional in definitions of slavery, in which slaves are persons deprived of key categories of kin. I suggest that this division obscures the ways that the bondage of kinship and the kinship of bondage feed into one another in a single field of relations. In the case of the chiefly household in Muyan, I argue that this field of relation is structured through a scripturation of the world, through which the ritualized fields of law, death, household space, and the administrative city were inscribed as kinship and servitude were reproduced. By scripturation, I just mean a kind of inscription that goes beyond what we conventionally term writing, and this will become more clear what I mean by this as the talk goes on. In working through the ways that diverse acts of scripturation communicated among vocal language, written language, and organized space, I follow a rich scholarship on varied modes of literacy by scholars such as Armando Petrucci, an Italian scholar writing about literacy, and those inspired by him would challenge the assumption that people who do not read and write written texts, strictly defined, are bereft of literacy's resources. They challenge this idea. Taking a cue from Michel de Certeau, I argue that this assumption obscures the ways that texts, and I mean texts in several senses, spoken, oral texts, inscribed texts, written texts. Anyway, this assumption obscures the ways that texts, formal, patterned, and inscribed, from written pages to spatial diagrams to recited refrains, permeate human worlds at every level, becoming available as sources for the expansion of action and experience, even for persons deliberately deprived of the capacity to read or write in conventional ways. The superb literature on legal writing during the Qing has focused on documents in bureaucratic Chinese, largely setting aside the fact, of which every scholar is nevertheless aware, especially in places like Xiamen, right, that the voices these documents collect and simulate were originally in many dialects and languages. In looking at plays authored by enslaved persons in a native domain, I want to experimentally expose some of the other modes of inscriptive textuality that lay beneath the surface of the legal archive, and that may have informed the ways that enslaved persons and their masters participated in the practice of legal writing in Chinese. Most people in Mulian, so this is again a native domain within Wuding, Zhou, most people in Mulian, especially those in the chiefly house, spoke a language we now call Nasu, and were heir to a very long tradition of writing in Nasu script, one of four or so scripts. Texts in Nasu scripts carried their own assumptions about what writing was and what it could do. In particular, Nasu script was intensely diagrammatic. Most Nasu texts were manuals for making differentiated social worlds ritually by sorting out kinds of beings such as agnates, affines, ritualists, bondsmen, slaves, spirits, and ghosts, all these different kinds of beings. Nasu textual practice repeatedly reframed the act of writing within writing itself, theorizing the powers of writing to remake relations amongst beings. So many acts of writing were really about what writing was, in essence. Texts written on paper were re-inscribed into the earth as fields of social beings. So this is a common Yi and Nasu ritual technique, is to diagram what should be made in a ritual field by putting it on paper, by writing it on paper, and then by making a diagram on paper, and then making it the same diagram in the ritual field. So texts written on paper were re-inscribed into the earth as fields of social beings, framed within houses, surrounded by territories, cross-cut by cosmic lines of force. The experience of Nasu textuality shared in different ways by all the litigants in this case, so every one of the people in this case had some relation to this kind of writing, even though most couldn't read, very likely heightened their awareness of questions of what writing was and what it could do as they sought to pose legal documents in Chinese, right? In Chinese. It's possible that many were doing other things with Chinese writing that could be read directly from the surface of the documents they produced. These suggestions guide two descriptive arguments that emerge from my outline of this legal case. First, has to do with a group of 14 men in a category of bonded persons particular to native domains, particular to, these people were called Tomu in Chinese, or Ma in Nasu, and I call them bondsmen in English. This is an argument about writing, and it illustrates the point that kinship and bondage should be seen as participating in a single field of relations. I'll suggest that these bondsmen were taking advantage of the expanded access to legal writing afforded by the Qing legal system to elaborate on a foundational task of Nasu ritual writing, the task of writing into existence kinship, ancestors, and the set. My second descriptive argument will return to the 6 domestic slaves who confessed their involvement with this group of rebel bondsmen. So I've got two groups, bondsmen or Mao Tomu on the one hand, and 6 slaves, or Jianu, on the other. This argument is about reading. It illustrates the point that reading and writing are complex human skills, often available even to those who can't use pen and paper, and involving the coordination of forms of textuality across different planes of inscription. I will follow these slaves through the streets of the administrative city as they search for a translator and a litigation master, to compose and submit their claim. I speculate that, though the city was alien to them, they were partially competent readers of it, having been guided through many diagrammatic analogues of the city as they served in their master's house and at his funeral. This competency is visible in the properly composed petition submitted to the magistrate's clerks and accepted by the court. So that's the introduction to this, basically what's a story. Now I'm going to get to tell you this story. At the core of this dispute was the question of whether the chieftain Nojayo had called 14 bondsmen to his sickbed to entrust them with his final will and testament. The chieftain's long marriage to Lady Anne, so Nojayo, the chieftain's long marriage to Lady Anne had produced a daughter but no sons. 8 months before, he had taken the 22-year-old Lady Tang as his only concubine, but she was not pregnant. Lady Anne testified, if her husband knew that he was dying, why would he allow his will to be arranged by rebels and child slaves? If he had been rendered so dim-witted by illness that he could not write, who among these slaves could have written it down? Any will should have been witnessed by the lineage elders and the chieftain's 3 sisters. Yet the key lineage elders had been away in the prefectural city, and the sisters lived elsewhere. Moreover, the 14 bondsmen could produce no written will. It's clearly a trumped-up situation, Lady Anne testified. For their part, the 14 bondsmen said that 7 days before his death, Nojayo had revealed to them that a baby born of a domestic slave named Shun was his son. The chieftain named the baby Shenzo and entrusted the bondsman with a written will adopting him as the chiefly heir. The bondsman arranged for their master's funeral, announced it to his agnates, his Zu, and sent messengers to his affines. The chieftain's 3 sisters, the ladies Noa, arrived with their husbands. The senior husband was Chang Shousi, chieftain of the neighboring native domain of Sadian. With secret blandishments, he duped Lady Anne into cooperating in an evil plot. So this, again, is the 14 bondsmen's testimony. With secret blandishments, Chang Shousi duped Lady Anne into cooperating into an evil plot. He shut the slave girl Shun and her baby up in a room, not allowing her to take charge of the funeral, as was her right as the heir's mother. So even though she's a slave, they say she should be taking charge of the funeral because she's the mother of the baby, who's the chieftain's son. After the funeral, Chang Shousi sealed the central gate of the chiefly house while his allies gathered and counted silver, grain, and land contracts. 27 days after the funeral, the gate was finally opened and the bondsmen entered. So these 14 bondsmen had been excluded from the house. They entered almost a month later. They freed Miss Shun and the baby, and they checked and recorded every item of property. They feared that Chang Shousi was planning to marry his son to the chieftain's daughter Yuxora locally, right? So Yuxora locally, you remember, means just the form of marriage in which a son comes and lives with the daughter in her parents' house. So they feared that Chang Shousi was planning to marry his son to the chieftain's daughter Yuxora locally, giving the Chang family control of the North chieftain's domain. So that was the bondsman's account. Chang Shousi's account was very different. When the funeral was over, Chang Shousi said he and the other 2 affines, that's the other 2 men who were married to the North sisters, stayed on to complete a month. He and the other 2 affines returned home, while their wives, the ladies Noa, stayed on to complete a month of mourning. The month had nearly passed. The month had nearly passed when the slave Ahan had appeared at Chang Shousi's gate. He had fled the domain of Mulian in the night and traversed the mountain range to Sadian. According to the slave's account, 14 of the chieftain's slaves, or Jianu, had savagely plotted together, drinking wine and smearing blood, chashe. Now, this is a special term, chashe. Together with Lady Tang, they had taken up weapons, crowded through the window of Lady Anne's boudoir, and beat her with fists and feet. Lady Anne fled weeping to the residence of the Noa sisters. The bondsmen blocked the path to the residence and mounted a rigorous guard. When rebellious slaves dare to do this much in the bright light of day, where is the law of the land? Chang Shousi protested. So that's Chang Shousi's testimony. Chang Shousi, the husband of the chieftain's sister. And then there was the testimony of the 6 domestic slaves. The slaves confessed that they had stupidly listened to Qiu Maocai, the head of the faction of 14 bondsmen, total bondsmen, who regaled them with tales of all the silver stored in the house. They had smeared blood again, cha xue. And I know you think I'm pronouncing that wrong, but I'll tell you why in a minute. They had smeared blood again, cha xue, with the bondsmen and Lady Tong in a conspiracy to plunder the chiefly house's property. But when Qiu Maocai offered them each 6 yuan of silver, and when the managing bondsman, Li Tingbi, whoops, there's Qiu Maocai, and then Li Tingbi, the managing bondsman, Li Tingbi, advised them that beating and humiliating Lady An was a crime that would never be pardoned. They saw their error, took fright, and sought refuge with Lady An in the Nuo sisters' residence to repent and seek forgiveness. Lady An delegated some to watch and hinder the rebels, and 2 to appeal to the Nuo agnates to rescue her. By the way, I'm saying Nuo, even though you see that the names are written Na, because Nuo is really the way it's pronounced locally, and it seems wrong to say Na when the people themselves pronounced it Nuo. Anyway, Lady An delegated some of the slaves to watch and hinder the rebels, and 2 of the slaves to appeal to the Nuo agnates, the cousins and basically the cousins of the chieftain, the Nuo agnates, to rescue her. She sent the slave Han to flee again in the night to alert her ally Chang Shousi. So that's the slave's account, the slave's testimony. When conspiring to do evil from the perspective of their betters, enslaved and bonded persons in Wulian were often accused in written Chinese of smearing blood. Locally, this idiom was written cha xue, with the very common character cha substituting as a localism or minor error for the specialized sha. In the classics, sha, such as Mao Zi, in the classics, sha xue meant to smear the blood of an animal or human sacrifice on your mouth, over one's mouth, to seal an oath. In Wulian, smearing blood, cha xue, was usually paired with drinking wine, right? So like cha xue he jiu. And evil conspiracies always included both animal sacrifice and drinking. In Nazi places, ceremonies marking treaties or alliances all required blood sacrifice. In one such rite, each party to an agreement brought a chicken, and then all of them together brought an ox, and the ox was killed with an axe, and its skin removed and draped over a wooden frame lengthwise, and then each party to the agreement burrowed under the skin from tail to head as though passing through the ox and emerging from its mouth. And then each drank a bowl of blood wine, soons, a cocktail of the blood of the ox, the blood of the chickens, and alcohol. The local ceremonies of alliance that smearing blood, or cha xue, translated were technologies for creating new forms of relationships, not stable relations of descent, like from chieftain to his son, but contingent relations of affiliation, such as alliances or friendships or groups, not relations of categorical hierarchy, but relations of negotiable equality, right? So relations amongst equals that could be negotiated, more or less equal, instead of categorical hierarchy. When Chang Shousi accused the 14 bondsmen of drinking wine and smearing blood, and when the slaves confessed to smearing blood, they were mobilized in a deep anxiety shared by native chieftains and their overseers in the Qing state about the foundations of the unstable alliance that was the native chieftain system. The system we call, tu, even though it's maybe not so much as a tu, it's not so systematic. Ever since the Ming conquest of the Yunnan Guizhou Plateau, the indigenous the native chieftains there had been granted limited autonomy in return for harnessing their indigenous or Tu populations thought to be naturally troublesome and rebellious. This control was founded on hierarchies of bondage within native domains. This control, right, of the Qing state, well, first the Ming and then the Qing state, over these native populations was founded on hierarchies of bondage within native domains. And these hierarchies all turned on the fulcrum of chiefly succession, the succession of chieftain from father to son. In Nasu places, blood was a ubiquitous metaphor for patrilineage. Blood was a ubiquitous metaphor for patrilineage. New relations of affiliation created through smearing blood, chashui, threatened both the existence of this native domain and the overarching order that employed native domains to divide uncivilized people or eat from civilized tax-paying citizens. Why? This sudden fluidity of relations was reflected in the strategies litigants in this case used to position others in categories of bondage. The most ambiguous category was Ma in Nasu Tomu in Chinese. And as I said, I am calling these persons bondsmen in English in analogy to the bondservants in the Qing imperial household. Bondsman recognizes that these persons were bound to or enslaved by the chiefly house, but is flexible enough to encompass their many roles and statuses. In 1956, ethnographers of the Ethnic Identification Project, right, the Ethnic Identification Project, briefly occupied the chiefly house in Muyang. Locals outlined the chiefly administration for them, and in this account, a minister assisted the chieftain in all his affairs and commanded the militia. A Chinese language secretary handled correspondence. A chief steward handled financial affairs. An assistant steward managed household life. An overseer and his assistant dispatched labor on the chieftain's private estates. 20 attendants passed on the chieftain's messages. 2 foresters managed the very large tracts of uncultivated land. And all of these persons, most of these persons, that is, inherited their positions, and all of these persons lived in the chiefly house, in this one large house, and these were all the Mao or the Tobu, many different statuses of Tobu. While this account may have sketched out the skeleton of an actual administration, so this account that locals were giving to these ethnographers, right, in 1956, may have sketched out the skeleton of an actual administrative structure, it can also be read as an idealized diagram of social roles and statuses, of the kind that in dynamic relation with sedimented experiences of the interpersonal relation anchors the structures of kinship and bondage. The ethnographers living in the chiefly house in 1956 seem to have intuited the diagrammatic character of this account, for with the help of locals who worked in the house, they created a careful plan of the residence, labeling each room with its category of residence. And you might not be able to see this diagram very well, and the details, for the purposes of this talk don't matter all that much. But this diagram structures the house around 5 courtyards, outer to inner. Quarters for domestic slaves are by the first courtyard, along with pigsties and stables. And then the second courtyard has residences for all the different categories of bondsmen or tobu, and also a jail. Not all of them, some of the different categories of bondsmen, and also a jail. And then past that is a hall for hearings, right, the Qing court, with guest rooms to one side. And then a third courtyard has more residences for bondsmen, different tobu, and a 2-story house or boudoir for wives and concubines. This is where the slaves broke into the window and beat Lady Han. And also a residence for the chieftain at the very end. And then a 4th courtyard had the hall for the ancestors and more rooms for domestic slaves. And then off to the side, a 5th courtyard had residences for the chieftain's daughters clustered around a pleasant cart farm. So if you'll notice, like the house was imagined to regulate categorical placement of residents, dividing the outer categories of residents from the ever more inner categories, all the way from pigs at one end to ancestors at the other. So all the way from the outer halls where the pigs lives to the most innermost hall where the ancestors lived, close to where the chieftain was, right? The 40 or so domestics, 40 or so domestic slaves with rooms at both the inner ends and the outer ends were unplaced and in motion throughout the house. Whereas the bondsmen each had their separate rooms and residences, the slaves were kind of in motion. They didn't really have a proper place. They had quarters where they slept, but they were all through the house. It's not that the house rigorously separated classes of persons. So it didn't really separate so much, keep people from relating to each other, keep the concubines in one place and the chieftain in another and the bondsman in another. It didn't do that. It was simply that the frames and planes of walls and doorways and their arrangement into series of outside gate, inside the gate, courtyard, and then outside the gate, inside the gate, second courtyard, and then again and again, provided material support for the conceptual work of sorting slave from bondsman, bondsman from chiefly family, and so on. I'm saying that this is a kind of material support for that conceptual work. And that's a reason why it was so easy to inscribe this sort of idea of what the administration looked like into this diagram of the house. The litigants in this case, and this is a picture of the house as it is now. It's now the Xiang government. The litigants in this case argued ferociously over the line that separated bondsman from domestic slave, replacing the ambiguous term tomu with more specific but just as problematic terms. For instance, Lady Anne accused the 14 bondsmen of hardly being chiefs or toldren, but merely being slaves, janu. They're not toldren, but janu. And others claimed that the bondsmen were slaves, janu, and newly recruited tenants that were passing themselves off as tomu in order to write official reports. The walls between slave and bondsman, or bondsman and chiefly family, were of interest to everyone in the domain, as structural failure here might shift the other lines that divided its various status of person. In a vivid illustration of this, a group of village headmen representing a large part of the domain took note of the chaos in the chiefly house, including the news that 14 so-called rebel slaves, the tomu, had broken into Lady Anne's room in a bid to make a slave baby the chiefly heir. In light of this terrible, actually, fact, they petitioned the magistrate to make a slave. They petitioned the magistrate to remove their villages from the native domain and place them under regular administration. So they're basically making the case that the chaos in the chiefly house is so bad, as is evidenced by this crazy proposition to make a slave baby the chiefly heir, that their villages should be removed from the domain altogether, right, and placed under regular bureaucratic administration. In the general upheaval in relations triggered by the chieftain's death, much depended on the intentions of the 14 bondsmen. Much depended on what these guys wanted. So one question is, what did these 14 bondsmen want? In Lady Anne's view, what the bondsmen wanted was obvious. They were conspiring with Lady Tang, the concubine, right, to steal as much of the household property as possible on behalf of Lady Tang's wealthy father, Tang Hongxu. So she's got a very wealthy dad who also has many slaves, and who's a Nasu nobleman actually himself, not quite a chief, but close to it. The district magistrate who had nominal oversight of the Mulian domain, right? This is a Zhou magistrate who had nominal oversight of the Mulian domain, interrogated the 14 bondsmen twice in the Yaman's court. It seems to have been traumatic for them. They did not speak Chinese, so now the scene shifts not away from the chiefly house to the court of the district of Zhou Yamen, right, the official court, right. And they did not speak Chinese, and they suspected that their translator had been suborned. They listened as they were accused of beating and insulting Lady An, not daring to open their mouths. Afterwards, they submitted a legal plaint, saying what they could not say in court. The child born of Miss Shen is truly the scholar Nuo Jiayu's bone and blood, they said. The chieftain evilly and cruelly did harm by not mentioning whether or not he did or did not have a son. We attest that we are no more than loyal victims in this affair. We obeyed our master's order to foster the orphan, achieving instead this crime. All of this is quotations translated from Chinese, into English. All this wounds the heart and cuts to the bone. The sages grow angry, the ancestors gnash their teeth. This was a legal complaint the bondsmen submitted to the court. Without standing on any status distinctions, the bondsmen were claiming to be mitigating the harm their master had inflicted on the chiefly house by not announcing an heir. In their account, their task was to produce an heir, to continue the chiefly lineage and the domain from being devoured by Changshu and the other Epons. In other words, their task was to reproduce their entire world, the house where they had been raised. Remember, these guys were all mostly descendants of former Tomu or bondsmen, all raised in the chiefly house from childhood, outside of which they had no place, no kin, no status, and no livelihood. They knew the importance of writing projected onto a richly ordered and publicly available screen for doing this. In their two plaints, they resorted to writing repeatedly that the baby Shenzhou was indeed and without question the son of Nuo Jiayu. During their interrogations, they discovered that there was little chance that the magistrate would hear their claims. The magistrate simply was not listening to them, yet they persisted, even so. A clue as to why can be found in their first legal claim. These small ones, they said, invited the agnates, the Zhu, to the funeral on the first day of the fourth month. It was the bondsman's responsibility to arrange funerals, the two very large funerals for the chieftain. In the first funeral, Nuo Jiayu's soul was found on the mountain, placed in an effigy, a little wooden thing, fed medicine for its illness, purged of its evil, and sent off on a beautifully adorned underworld horse. Off to the underworld. His kin gathered around fire and coffin in positions that depended on their category of relation to the corpse. This order of relation to the corpse was indicated in diagrams appended to texts recited at the funeral. This is one of the texts that was read out or recited at the funeral, and a diagram along with it. In the second funeral, an ancestral body, I'm calling these little things called in Nasu, ancestral bodies, because they look like bodies, right? An ancestral body was fashioned, two figurines of greenstone, one male and one female. And the male has silver on in his joints here, and the female has gold in her joints. Maybe this is a female. One male and one female, placed in a wooden shell, right? The shell placed together like this, like a walnut almost, right? They're placed together face to face in a wooden shell. And then the shell is inserted into a red cloth and then into this little deerskin bag. And then placed in, so there's a red cloth, right? And then placed in a upright hollowed section of a peach log. And the chieftain's name was written in Nasu, was written on a piece of silk and placed inside the log. And then a young agnate carried the log up to a cliff cave where all the new ancestral bodies, all little effigies like this, were placed inside their little logs, placed side by side on an altar in genealogical order. That is, in this chieftain, then this chieftain, then this chieftain, then this chieftain, right? All in order. This living agnate's name, too, was written on a strip of silk, was placed inside the log, demonstrating that the living will follow their ancestors, as Ma Xueliang, the linguist who recorded this ceremony in the 1940s, wrote. In these diagrams, a world of Qin was arranged around the body, written as a string of bodies stretching into the ancient past. These little bodies all stretching back into the ancient past. Descent was fashioned into lineage through inscriptive acts of settling souls into ancestral bodies, naming these bodies in writing, and linking them in writing to living bodies. So remember, the names are written on pieces of silk, and those pieces of silk is first the chief's generation, and then a young agnate and his generation, and these are all written down on silk and then placed inside these bodies. Lining ancestral bodies up in order of descent while reading and writing their names was the way that Nasu sorted out unilineal patrilineage, just pruning branches and suturing gaps. So these lineages actually stretch on, enormous. They're very famous because they're enormously long, and they stretch all the way back to the first ancestor who survived the flood in a peach log like this, right? And you can't actually have a lineage like this because it's without doing something like this to make it through writing or through bodies. Simply, if only because, as we know from the history of this chieftainship, it's really hard to have sons all the time, to pass the lineage down. And this is a case in which it was just hard to have a son. You just couldn't have a son. You had to make them. You had to produce them. And this is one of the ways to produce sons and then to produce ancestors, right? And then as these rows of bodies were placed on altars and made and placed on altars, they were inscribed into paper in textual genealogies that stretched back in a single line all the way to a guy named Aliaro, the first chieftain in history, really in written on Chinese written history, the first chieftain we have record of in the 10th century, and then back as many as 47 further generations into the ancient past. This was the structured skeleton of the native domain, right here, these little bodies. The structured skeleton of the native domain. The agnates, the Zhu, holding down the domain's peripheral regions. The chieftains would send their sons out to have little to have households in the peripheral regions of the domain in order to keep them, right? And the affines, the people that these sons were all married to, the affines, such as Zhang Shosu, right, helping defeat the Qing state's episodic attempts to absorb the domain fully into regular administration. And of course, also many times in Nasu history, affines created enormous trouble, rebellion, and helped the Qing state wipe out their affines. But in any case, this was the skeleton of the chiefly domain. And on this skeleton hung the tissues of bondage, the bondsmen of the chiefly house, the slaves of that house, the Janu, the bonded tenants, and I haven't really talked about that category of person, but there were tenants who were actually bonded to the chiefly house, couldn't move away, didn't own their own land. The bonded tenants who filled its granaries. Simply put, these bondsmen knew very well that kinship was made and shaped through writing, projected onto a ritual plane. They knew no possibilities for life independent of the chiefly house of lineage. Taking them at their word, so listening to what they actually said instead of what other people said about them, taking them at their word, they were working to rescue the chiefly house and the domain from annihilation with the most powerful means they had at their disposal, extending the inscriptive activities of the funeral by writing descent and writing lineage, writing the entire world of action and experience back into existence. the Qing legal system in these plaints, in these legal plaints that these bondsmen were participating in, the Qing legal system became a ritual system in this project. They're using it in the same way that we use a Nasu ritual system. A formally ordered public screen on which to project ritual writing. Qing legal writing was ideal for this purpose. Through the illegal, despised, ubiquitous, and indispensable institution of litigation masters, or songshi, legal writing had been opened up in the Qing to formerly silent classes of persons, such as widows and farmers, and even in rare cases, slaves. And we have this beautiful, amazing literature about this in English, especially Melissa McCauley's book in English about litigation masters. So, I mentioned at the beginning of this talk, I mentioned Marissa Fuentes and her work on Bridgetown, Barbados. I'm coming back to that right now. When writing about these enslaved women in Bridgetown, Barbados, Marissa Fuentes talks about reading along the bias grain. This is actually a kind of term that even for those of us who are native English speakers, it's really hard to know what bias grain means. But what it means is, she says, like cutting fabric on the bias to create more elasticity, reading along the bias grain expands the legibility of these archival documents to accentuate the figures of enslaved women who are a spectral influence on the lives of white and black men and women. So what she's saying here is like, if you cut cloth diagonally, and so the warp and weft, right, of the cloth go in a simple tabby way, you say go like this, right? And if you cut diagonally across the grain, then the cloth expands. You can expand it and stretch it, and it takes different shapes. And so figuratively, she's saying, in the archive, instead of reading against the grain, and like many people talk about reading against the grain, reading between the lines, she wants to read along the bias grain, cut it diagonally in a different way so that it expands, and we can be more imaginative, I guess you would say, about what happens in these documents in the archive, precisely because the voices of people such as slaves are very, very difficult to retrieve from the archive. And so we have to expand it a bit, spill out its contents into the streets a bit, in order to really understand something of what their experience might be. And in one effort to do this, to make the archive more lasting, Fuentes looks at an escaped slave and follows this woman through the streets of Bridgetown. And she follows this woman, and then she remarks on all the different kinds of architectural features in this city that the slave woman would have encountered at the time that she had escaped, right? This is a woman who was very familiar with this city. So this and the architecture of Bridgetown, Barbados is a kind of carceral architecture. It was an architecture that was precisely developed in order to keep slaves confined, in order to capture freed slaves, in order to punish slaves as well. And this is a very eloquent book about this. This young woman's flight, she writes, maps the sensorial and architectural history in this urban site from an enslaved woman's perspective. So even though she doesn't have the voice of this woman, if she follows her through the street and sort of sees a little bit about what she saw, she can retrieve a little bit of what that woman's experience might have been. So it maps the sensorial and architectural history of this urban site from the woman's perspective and redirects the historian's focus to the sensorial perspective of the historically disempowered slave woman. And so, even though she's not putting it this way, Fuentes is arguing that the city for this long-time resident, this slave resident, who lived there and served her mistress there, was legible
was readable to this slave, enslaved person, and that the perspective on the streets of this city were deepened by these streets' histories of carceral architecture, histories of the architecture of imprisonment. So, imitating this rather audacious strategy of spilling the archives out, the contents of the archives out into the spaces in which they were created, I want to consider the conditions of legibility that made it possible for even enslaved persons to attain a kind of spatial competency in a strange city, not one they were familiar with. And to do this, I want to speculatively consider how the plaint authored by those 6 slaves, those Jianu, not Tomu, but Jianu, those very domestic slaves, the very lowest in this hierarchy. I want to consider how that document, how that document might have come into being, come into existence. And I want to argue that Ahan and his companion, their participation in legal writing in the Qing across the dense bureaucratic spaces of the city, the domestic spaces of the chiefly house in which they've been raised, and the ritual spaces of the funeral in which they just had participated, in which they their experience worked out rough correlations between these different kinds of spaces. And I want to say that reading is always a contingent coordination of such planes or series, some in flesh, that is some material, and others immaterial, others insubstantial. So even though it was illegal technically for anyone other than a clerk of the court, authorized by the yamen, to write a plaint for someone who was incapable of writing his own, independent litigation masters, or songshi, often wrote and submitted most legal complaints for pay. Even the literate gentry often did not handle their own legal writing, turning to litigation masters for their experience in making concise and convincing arguments, and for their familiarity with the legal culture of the yamen. So-called habitual litigation masters were to be found residing in nearly every county town and every prefectural town, often in league with innkeepers and restaurant owners who offered hospitality to rural people who came in to, when they were summoned by the court or when they wanted to present a case to the court. To have a plaint written up, Ahan and his companion had to travel from their domain, Mulian domain, to the city. 3 days travel. They had to locate a litigation master in the city, convince that person to help. They also had to locate a translator because they didn't speak Chinese. And they had to find a way to pay that litigation master. So how did they do that? This is Hongqiuzhou within Wuding Prefecture. And it's today it's Wuding Xian, Wuding County. And Mulian is in the northern part of this, Wanda now. Mulian extended past Hongqiuzhou, but was mostly within Hongqiuzhou. And it was overseen, the chieftain here in Mulian was overseen by the Zhou magistrate, who was also located within the Fu, right, the Wuding Fu, the Fu city. So irritated by all the plaints and counterplaints coming from Mulian, this place where he'd never been and never hoped never to go, the magistrate of Hongqiuzhou district ordered all the parties in this case to come to the city to assemble in the prefectural capital. The bondsmen lifted the blockade of the Nuo sisters' residence, and Lady Anne and the 3 Nuo sisters set off together. So the magistrate actually sent a runner, right, to the domain and gave his order for everybody to come. And the 3 Nuo sisters and Lady Anne traveled to the city together. But none of the men were with them. None of their husbands were with them. Lady Anne brought along these 6 slaves, these 6 Jianu. they can give evidence as to the beating, insulting, and robbing, he reasoned. After 3 days of travel, they arrived in the capital. And of course, the slaves also, carried Lady Anne, right? It wasn't just that they could give evidence as to the beating and humiliation. They also had to carry these people. And there were other slaves along as well. Or at least, I'm not sure about those other slaves. There were at least other hired laborers to help carry these things. On approaching the city, they were held up by bondsmen Tohu and slaves Jiangu from the opposing party, from the other side in Mulian, and robbed of their traveling supplies. So all the action is moving from Mulian domain up here down to the city here. The bondsmen lifted their, they were robbed of their traveling supplies. The situation was indescribably savage, the Noah sisters testified later. Nevertheless, unharmed, the party rushed through the massive northern gate of the city. This gate faced the sprawling mountainous north of the prefecture with its large non-Han population. It was named Fu Soothing the Yi. After first being turned, that's the name of the gate. Each of the 4 gates has a name. After first being turned away from the district yamen, the party was finally accepted there and confined to guest quarters. Guards mounted at the door. So, the ladies all come in, they're given a room, but they're guarded, right? They're not allowed to leave because they're there for a tryout. After 9 days of being confined within the yamen, Lady Anne and the Noah sisters were publicly interrogated in the yamen's great hall. Several weeks later, these 4 women, a group of village headmen, and 6, I don't have time to tell you much about these village headmen, but they're quite important too. But a group of village headmen and the 6 slaves all submitted plaints on the same day, followed closely by another group of village headmen and a group of bondsmen loyal to Lady Anne. So all of these people are submitting plaints on Lady Anne's behalf, in her favor, on her side. The women remained confined to their quarters in the yamen during this time, but the slaves seem to have come and gone freely, relaying messages to all these people. So it's the slaves who are being sent out to coordinate all this legal action with these other people who are gathered in the city. Lady Anne and the Noah sisters needed a litigation master to handle their plans. And it's very likely that Ahan and his 5 enslaved companions who made contact, seizing this opportunity to create their own document. The slaves' own plan was written in blunter language, with fewer rhetorical flourishes. It was probably penned by a different litigation master, who helped them forge the confusing events that followed their master's death into a plausible narrative. A flat denial of criminality would inevitably be contradicted by people of higher status and serve only to condemn them. So they worked out a way to narrate their temptation, their grave mistakes, their awakening to a fear of punishment, their flight into refuge, and their service to their mistress, lining up these elements like beads on a string. Their litigation master may have been cut rate, he may have been cheap, but he was skilled enough to flesh out this sequence with blunt sentences on a single sheet of paper, to get that paper stamped by the clerk of the court, and to submit it to the proper office. Where did they find him? Their route through the city left no traces, but maps and descriptions in the Kamshi, the 1689 gazetteer provided hints. The city was small within its wall, and it had no suburbs without. Yet it ambitiously attempted to contain within its cramped square kilometer the whole of imperial civilization, expressing in a pairing of state organs, the whole of imperial civilization expressed in a pairing of state organs with institutions of literacy, aspiring to fold these into the hinterland beyond the North Gate, including the E. So I'm just saying, this is a very important city for the administration of this region. And in addition to its military and bureaucratic importance. Its symbolic importance was that it included all of these institutions that you found in every county town and every Zhou town together in this tiny place, and was hoping to influence this hinterland with these institutions of civilization. As they emerged from the front gate of the district yamen, these slaves would have faced the city wall, looming up against any morning sun. It was the 5th month, gray, sodden weather. To their left was the warden's office, the Wuting of the Yichu, headquarters for frontier security officers. Beyond this, the southern half of the city was occupied by the yamens of the prefecture. Their austere, columned fronts shutting out the dim sunlight from the east. There was a prefectural yamen, a separate yamen for the assistant prefectural magistrate, the army's yamen, and the yamen of the imperial censor, Shitai, now uses a branch of the prefectural yamen. All of these quite large institutions in that half of the city. Han and the others had little reason to linger in the southern part of the city, packed with government compounds. Instead, they would have walked north, back along the route on which they had entered the city. They were already familiar with this route. They'd come through this way. Here, the streets were lined with shops and residences. 70 years before, the shops had names like First Prefectural Shop, Mountaintop Shop, and Neighborly Kindness Shop. Near the north gate was a pond, built to center and contrast with the city's peripheral form. The built city was referred to in the gazetteers as Chengchi, wall and pond. Around the pond were clustered the city's institutions of civil religion and literacy. On the west side was Guandi Temple and the city god temple. These hosted, the city god temple. These hosted both official ceremonies and popular cults. They were the only places where bureaucrats and commoners sometimes mixed. On the north side was the Wenmiao, the temple of civil culture, Wenmiao, which hosted the annual Confucian rites and provided support for the exam system. East of this was a Wuyang charitable academy, where sons of gentry prepared for the imperial exams. The open square between the bustling and colorful temples for Guandi and the city god on one side, and the ascetic and dignified academy and temple of civil culture on the other side, was a natural place for Han and the others to begin their search for a litigation master. This was a place for markets and fairs and theatrical performances where resident and itinerant persons of all classes gathered. The city god was ruler of the local dead and the focus of popular religion. Oh crap, I'll go a little faster, sorry. I'm going really slow, and so I'm taking too much time, but I'll be done soon, hopefully. The city god was ruler of the local dead and focus of popular religion about ghosts and natural forces. The temple of civil culture was a place for ritualized veneration of the written word. This confluence was deeply familiar to the slaves as the center of all ritual practice in their home, in which the power of writing on which they were hoping to draw was manifest. More than this, the entire city, if not recognizable, would have been legible, at least in fragments, and perhaps after a little walking as a whole, Chengchi, wall and pond. Though they could not read and write, they knew what a spatial diagram was, and they had participated in structures of legibility fashioned by writing, where a ritual space, like a house or a courtyard, was inscribed on paper and inscribed again on a ritual field. At Nuo Jiayou's funeral, they had hauled firewood while literate ritualists called Beima built the ritual ground. This was a city already. This was a city, this ritual ground, with arbors as buildings. Arbors, like the little built structures, hosting a crowd of ancestral beings and their many guardians and opponents. The central texts for this funeral diagrammed this field in drawings like this one, showing the coffin emerging from the ritual ground, a house with 3 gates. Each one of these is a gate, right? And 3 courtyards, echoing the structure of the chiefly house and also of every yamen in the city. Around the field are the seats for the gathered spirit and advocates and opponents of the dead, right? Another diagram looks much like the map of the administrative city, the Fu. A line encloses the ritual field made of many pairs of branches. A ritualist, a Beimao, just diagnosed these paired branches from Australia in 1942 as texts and ghosts, each pair an unspecified textual character and an unspecified ghost, modeling the form of writing. Just very quickly, I want to say these little swirls are meant to signify each a little pair of branches, one with, say, this is a branch with leaves on it, and one without leaves on it. One was text, writing, the other was ghost. In a way, this is a kind of right? One a graph, and one the meaning of that graph, the ghost. But they're not specified. It's like an empty graph, an empty character, and a ghost signifying an empty meaning. And these are placed around the field like this. It's a kind of semiotic theory right here in this line around the field. The ritual field within is shown as a fine multi-story building resembling the chiefly house and its analogs in the city, with a front gate, the courtyard, and an inner gate, the altar, all in here. Surrounded by seats for various participants, spirit and human. And a third, so very much like the city in that way. And then in a third diagram, the line of ghosts and text is shown as a line of people walking around the periphery, reading the line of text with their feet. So if these little kind of little semiotic theory of what writing is and what you do with it, one of the things you do with writing is you walk it, right? And one of the ways writing is read is by walking. This dude right here, this guy right here is a Beimao, a literate ritualist who has a text right in front of him, and he's reading it, and this guy is leading it go, and then all these other guys, each one of them has a flag or emblem, a musical instrument, even rifles, some of them, all walking around this line of text, really, that is inscribed into the earth. To read these diagrams was to double them, to inscribe them into the earth like this in the ritual field. Each arbor or building, each ponzi or each little site in that field expressed the attributes of the beings that occupied it. So, for instance, bare oak branches for the black arbor, it's a prison for crimes and disasters. A league oak branch for a spirit named Qing, a spirit that spread its wings over the field to protect it. And the city, too, could be read easily enough in this way. The closed yamen gates, the blocky warden's office, the lively sight of the pond with its differentiated temples. In other words, the city's legibility was the same order of legibility as a ritual field. Outer gate, courtyard, inner gate, first hall, third gate, second hall, archive, right? This arrangement was repeated in each yamen and academy and the school temple. Every gate filtered persons and documents. Though they'd never passed the gates of any yamen except for the one where their mistress was confined, the slaves knew this arrangement well, because it was the plan of the chiefly house, the same arrangement that partitioned and ordered every hour of their days. Their advantage as readers was that as slaves they had no assigned seat. They moved unremarked through the house between pigs on the one hand and ancestors on the other hand. They moved among all the seats for formal kin on a ritual field in the same way, unfree but mobile. It wasn't a carcelage architecture. It wasn't an architecture of imprisonment, like many places in the Atlantic region, like Marissa Fuentes writes about. Yet it was still an architecture of power, where the capacity to shape others' actions was a matter of managing the flows of persons and texts through the levels of these forms. Ahan and his associates saw this arrangement repeated as rituals inscribed power-laden spaces in ritual fields, shaping the acts of human and non-human inhabitants, writing layered space into visible and traversable zones on the one hand, and hidden and guarded zones on the other hand. Writing alone provided entrance to these hidden zones, where the past, say, a subpoena from the magistrate, where life and death were decided. The city's visible spaces, the closed column fronts of the yamen, the open, lively plaza around the pond, were easily read as outward manifestations of this inner involution of text and space. Though it was not unusual for widows like Lady Anne to submit legal plaints on their own behalf, it was extremely unusual for slaves, not to mention so-called e-slaves who could not speak Chinese. I have been arguing here that these 6 domestic slaves' focused intervention in the involuted spaces of writing in the city could only have been made on the grounds of a sophisticated understanding of what writing was and what it could do. Their finding someone to make that legal claim could only have been done because they already knew a lot about writing, even though they couldn't read. They knew that such writing layered built space into outer and inner zones, the traps of power. They could see how acts on one plane, making an offering, smearing blood, breaking through a window, might reverberate on other planes. In this way, they knew what reading was, the coordination of points on different planes through distributed relays. That's what reading really is. The city was legible to them, readable, I'm saying, because they knew about legibility and how to look for it. Legibility was merely the awareness that the spaces they were traversing in order to get some writing done were inscribed across several planes, some already familiar. Okay, sorry, I've taken a long time here, and I apologize for that. So now I have a conclusion. This archive of legal plaints in Chinese was preserved together with over 500 manuscripts in Nasu script in the same archive in the Luo chieftain's house. And I've approached these plaints in Chinese with an eye to the rich context of ritualized Nasu writing in this native domain, and this has produced a sense of the thoroughgoing scripturation of the word, a kind of writing of the word. Rooted in Nasu textual practice and extended into the realm of legal writing in Chinese. Ritualized Nasu textual practice produced understandings of what writing was and what it could do that shaped the ways that litigants from Wulian domain participated in Qing legal practice. The actors in this case had doubtless attended many ritual occasions, such as these funerals, especially these funerals, where Nasu texts were recited, copied, and inscribed into the earth in the form of little spirit seats and harbors. As they author plaints in Chinese, I've suggested Nuo Jiayou's wife and affiant and concubines, bondsmen, and domestic slaves were projecting Nasu scriptural practices onto the ritualized screen of the Chinese legal system. They're using it the same way they would use Nasu ritual. And in particular, I've tried to show how the bondsmen used legal writing to promote a slave lady as the chiefly heir were continuing practices of making descent of lineage through writing in the form of ancestral bodies and in the form of script. They're just doing the same thing they did at the funeral, except using the Qing legal system to do it, to create this new chieftain. And in this story, bondage was one of the many forms of kinship framed by the walls and opening of the chiefly house, not, as in many conventional definitions, the condition of being cut off from kinship. Slavery was a kind of kinship. To work to preserve that house was to struggle to reproduce the kinship of bondage. That's why these Tongmu were so interested in preserving and recreating the chieftain and the house. It's because their own kinship system was involved. In addition, I've followed a group of domestic slaves as they came to participate in this project of making kin through legal writing, and I've speculated, as you've seen, that those slaves might have found amidst their strange circumstances echoes and resemblances of Nasu ritualized textual practice, which made the Fu, the administrative city, partially legible to them, and in this way creating new opportunities for action and experience. And I hope that this has opened up some broader possibilities for thinking about what literacy, what reading and writing actually means here. So actually, I am done, except not quite, because I haven't told you the rest of the story, and so I'll tell you it very quickly. We left this case with Lady Anne and the Nuo sisters and their allies amongst the bondsmen and village headmen of the domain, all employing social litigation masters to scribble plaints, to scribble plaints for them. And more testimony followed. Lady Tang fiercely disputed a charge from Lady Anne that she had been having an affair with Chiu outside the head, the leader of the bondsmen, or her allies. She was like, no, I'm not having an affair. The bondsman gave evidence that's the very bad character of Chuang Shousi, whose father had lost his head in an act of rebellion against the Qing. Everybody knows this guy, they say, and he's a very bad actor. And he was, actually. Lady Anne and her supporters realized that the claim to be nurturing a slave baby as the chieftain's heir gave the other side an unfair advantage. The other side had a baby, an heir to the chief, and they did not. So they made one too. There was another Ms. Shun in the household who was a sister of the first Ms. Shun, and she also had a baby. So Lady An named this child Yao Zong, implicitly saying it was his brother of Shenzong, right? And took him under protection as the chieftain's son. He was a son, she said, of the chiefly heir. In 2 months, the magistrate rendered his opinion on the case. As the chieftain's first wife, Lady An would be granted care of the 2 orphans and raise them as her sons. Lady Tang, merely a concubine after all, and the baby's 2 enslaved mothers would be set up in appropriate circumstances, taken care of. This is obviously the proper Confucian way to treat this case, right? And then all the parties in this case would assemble and jointly sign a statement to this effect. Well, they did that. They assembled, but the meeting did not go well at all. Lady An declared herself willing to accept the magistrate's compassionate order. It's in her favor, but a senior lineage elder protested that this was the first time he had heard of any sons and declared himself unwilling to accept this unexpected news. It's like, really, one of the cousins should be the chieftain, not one of these slave babies. Lady Tang, the concubine, argued that she should be the one to raise the orphans, and she should be the one to take charge of the royal family. Decidedly unconfucian solution. The 6 village headmen, that's Yao Zong, the infant son of the second slave baby, and then the 6 village headmen brokered a compromise. Lady An could adopt the elder baby Shenzong. Lady Tang could have the younger baby Yao Zong. Shenzong would inherit 60% of the domain, and Yao Zong would inherit 40%. And in addition, seizing the moment, the village headmen declared their own districts, the ones that these 6 represented, would no longer be subject to the chiefly lineage. They would be taken from the domain and placed under regular administration. The 2 Ms. Shuns each followed her baby to separate residences of wife and concubine. No mention was made of the 6 slaves who had intervened in the case with their own complaint. The magistrate agreed to this compromise, and then, in his only judgment, there was not simply an affirmation of decisions already made by the chiefly kin and bonded persons. He also granted that demand of the 6 village headmen that their districts should no longer be part of the domain, thus carving off a very large section of the domain and placing it under regular administration. Obviously, the thing that every magistrate wanted. Yet this was not the end of writing the San Community, even in this generation. More than 20 years later, the chieftain Nuo Shenzong occupied the land of his brother Nuo Yaozong and accused him of being fathered by a slave. Yaozong unsuccessfully sought legal relief at every level of imperial administration, finally traveling to Beijing to appeal the case. He made a terrible nuisance of himself, in fact. Tragically, the records of this case are not preserved in the Nuo archive, but there are a few mentions in the court records of the Qianlong Emperor. In 1792, the Qing Minister of Defense commanded that the imperial censor of Hunan go to Yunnan and resolve the case. After investigation, the censor judged Yao Zong to be the son of a slave and condemned him to military slavery in the Northwest, where doubtless he died quickly. Shenzong governed the native domain for 4 decades. He died in 1815, leaving a wife, 3 concubines, 6 daughters, 18 total, 18 bondsmen, and dozens of jianu, dozens of domestic slaves, but no heir. Again, no son. Several months later, his wife, Lady Sha, filed the first in a long series of legal claims. Okay, sorry for taking such a long time.
Hello. So Professor Mueggler just gave us a wonderful talk. Now, should we open the floor for audience to raise questions? 能听得到吗？亚辉。
我听得到，没问题，您说吧。
So now we open the floor to audience.
All right.
Okay.
All right.
So you are the first one to raise questions. Are you? 雅辉，你提问题吗？现在？
我想我先说两句吧，也不一定是问题，学习的体会吧。
你是讨论者，当然。
So Professor Mueggler, thank you for your wonderful lectures. And I have other materials about the connection between the caricature and the house of a handman. Maybe for the audience, we should talk in Chinese, and I will translate it. For you, or you can understand me, so it's simple. 因为在这个边疆上，其实有很多这种例子，就是地方头人的这个房子，而不是他的亲属制度，作为一种政治传承的依据。这个研究现在在中国还挺火的，有挺多人关注这个事儿。就是你的整个空间的书写，the mapping of the space， 空间的书写实际上会和文字的书写以及国家的形象这三者之间其实会建造一个联系。那么在这个联系里头，我觉得今天Mueggler教授特别精彩的就在于这一点，他发现了说城市的空间的书写方式，然后土司的房子的这个空间的书写方式，以及祖先的亡灵的那个空间安排的书写方式，怎么样被几个奴隶的一纸诉状把它连在了一起，并且实现了这个土司的房子的这个再生产。我觉得这是一个非常非常精彩的一个案例。我其实有一个特别小的问题，就是在您的文章的最后，你提到有6个村子，6个村子在这个过程当中，它脱离了这个土司的管辖，成为了国家的一部分。那么恰好呢，是我在卓尼的调查里面，古邦先生1940年代，也是就是跟马学良先生同时代的一个人类学家，他也提到了一个同样的个案，也是因为用这种文字的方式，就是少数民族的贵族用文字的方式向汉人国家或者是向清朝去提起诉讼的时候，最后的代价好像也是这个，就是有一些村子会脱离土司的统治。我想问Mueggler教授的问题就是，这个是否可以看作是当你的地方性的这些政治危机出现，你诉诸中央，通过文字书写向中央的国家去提起诉状的时候的一个必然的代价。Do you understand me?
I'm sorry, there was part of this. So you're saying Ma Xueliang in 1940?
At the time of Ma Xueliang, Professor Gu Bao is a student of Professor Feng Xiaotong, who worked in the area of Gannan, Tibetan area. You know, I found the same case.
I mean, yeah. Actually, I'm very interested in this question, and this is one reason I was interested, Professor Zhang, in giving this talk. Is I'm very interested in whether you might have some kinds of comparative cases.
Yeah, of course.
That I could think about.
Mm-hmm. So my question is there any kind of a price for the handman of frontier to provide maybe law or other risks to the central government, and some villages will cut off from the government of the handman?
No, I understand, and there are many. So it's a very, very complex dynamic that's going on during the Qing in this area, as of course you know, and there are many different kinds of
we call we say to do, right? But really, the more you look into different different these guys, for instance, weren't really 吐司. They were like they were 吐舍, right? They were very low level. But the more you look into different arrangements, the more you see a kind of dynamic, different kinds of dynamics playing out. The constant was, of course, that the Qing administration had specific requirements and desires for for incorporating these places into regular administration. So there was that pressure. But it's very interesting that each case is sort of negotiated